Hello and welcome to the webinar, Using Forecast Collaboration Tools to Align the Supply and Demand Sides of the Supply Chain, part of TAKE's new webinar series, Optimizing Supply Chains in a Global and Mobile Economy. My name is Donna Fritz and I'm the Director of Product Marketing for TAKE Supply Chain Solutions. Joining us on the presentation today are Simon Ellis, Practice Director for IDC Manufacturing Insights, and Dudley Lance, Sales Director for TAKE Supply Chain Solutions. Before we get started, I'd like to take a few moments to cover some housekeeping items, which you can see on the screen. All of the attendees will be on mute. You can submit questions to contact@takesolutions.com. If you have any technical difficulties during the presentation, you can contact WebEx customer support at 1-866-229-3239. Select option 1. This session will be available on demand on our websites takesolutions.com and onesCM.com in a couple of days. And one last note, due to a last-minute scheduling conflict, this presentation has been recorded. Thank you for joining this broadcast, which will last approximately 45 minutes. Today, Simon will be discussing IDC research and analysis on supply chain clock speed alignment related to forecast collaboration, quality, service, and the impact on the value chain. Dudley will be discussing specific strategic and tactical benefits of forecast automation and presenting a couple of customer case studies. Simon and Dudley will be responding to questions at the end of this broadcast. We'll answer the questions in the order received, and we'll stay on the line for approximately 10 minutes. At this point, I'll turn the presentation over to Simon. Welcome, Simon. It's great to have you with us today.
Thanks, Donna. Great to be here. So I'm gonna talk a little bit about this idea of forecast collaboration, this sort of notion of clock speed between the supply and demand sides of the supply chain. At IDC Manufacturing Insights, I have responsibility for the supply chain practice, and so I talk to a lot of manufacturers, a lot of end users, a lot of sort of thought leaders in the industry. About some of the challenges that face supply chains, about some of the challenges that face manufacturers, and so I'm going to talk a little bit about some of these challenges, just three of the ones that I certainly think are perhaps the most significant today, and then a little bit about clock speed and what cadence mismatches, and then what that means for planning and planning collaboration. Next slide, please. So I think of the sort of the big trends that we see, I think perhaps the biggest one, or certainly the one that's getting a lot of attention these days, is this notion of the empowered consumer. And I think, certainly years ago we talked about the connected consumer and the sort of the idea that the consumer was becoming more and more involved in the commercial relationship. But I think, what we've seen in the last couple of years is that connectivity, that notion of connectedness, really has transformed into much more of an empowered consumer. These people have ubiquitous access to information. They certainly have a stronger voice. I think they're certainly more value-oriented and happy not to spend. I think, as we've all seen, people these days seem to be sort of quite happy to be privately happy with their purchases. But if something goes wrong or something doesn't meet their expectations, they're equally happy to be publicly unhappy and sort of broadcast it to the world through Twitter and Facebook and those kinds of things. I think what we're seeing as a result of this empowered consumer is much more intense brand competition. I think there's much more transparency to purchases. I think we also see, certainly in some of the consumer-facing businesses, industries, manufacturing and retail, sort of battling for the consumer. And on this slide, I've sort of put battle in italics because they aren't sort of standing in the store fighting each other, but they certainly are thinking about what the sort of the respective roles are around this notion of the omni-store, or this sort of this notion of the omni-channel consumer, who frankly, I think is increasingly willing to shop virtually, shop physically, and really to view the two as simply flip sides of the same shopping experience. I have an example here on the slide. One of the businesses that I've worked with over the years was actually a New Jersey car dealership, and the general manager of this dealership made the observation that customers are coming into his dealership knowing more about the margin on the vehicles than his salespeople do, and he observed that isn't always the best position to be in if you actually want to make any money. So clearly this empowered consumer is having an enormous effect on the manufacturing industry, on the supply chain. And it moves really to the second of the three big trends I want to mention today. Next slide, please, which is that of demand volatility. And I think we've all sort of seen press releases and surveys that talk about the fact that demand is more volatile than ever. I certainly think in the surveys that we've done at IDC and IDC Manufacturing Insights, we certainly see that. And here on the slide, I sort of have this notion of the forecast-centric versus the response-centric supply chain, where the forecast-centric is where we have the perfect forecast and we make entirely to stock because we know exactly what we're going to sell and we can replenish it effectively, versus kind of the response-centric side, which is, well, I make everything to order because my forecast is awful. I can't rely on it, and/or I'm customizing or configuring my products. And so I basically have enough capacity so that I can meet the largest possible instantaneous order, and I make them to order. So we sort of have a response-centric on one side, a forecast-centric on the other. But the reality is that the vast majority of businesses are in the middle, and so they have to balance forecasting. They have to balance forecasting with responsiveness. And certainly from my perspective, as companies increasingly look to do a better job of sensing demand, either from point of sale or from customer orders or from vendor-managed inventory signals, I think what they're increasingly finding is that often forecasting is not the major problem. A lack of flexibility is that if you accept for the moment that the forecast is never going to be perfect, then that flexibility becomes critical if indeed you're going to manage against variations to the plan. We see, I think, increasingly, and this tracks back to the notion of the empowered consumer, I think we see increasingly this sort of expectation for mass customization. I know that I've written over the past couple of years that personalization is another P for the 4 Ps of marketing, right? It's a 5th or even 6th P if you think people might be one as well. But I think companies increasingly are trying to understand how to personalize for their consumers, and it puts some real pressure on the supply chain. We've seen supply chain segmentation, for example, come back into vogue the last couple of years. I mean, it's been around certainly in supply chains for decades, but just in the last couple of years, along with postponement, we've seen sort of renewed interest, because I think the challenges that face supply chain organizations, the challenges that face manufacturers, really lend themselves to these kinds of things like supply chain segmentation and like postponement. And the quotation I have here on the slide is from a global disk drive manufacturer, who kind of makes the point that he's seen some fairly substantial diversification of the business, right? So, 5 years ago, the bulk of his products, if not all of them, went to the major original equipment manufacturers. They went into laptops, into other kinds of computer hardware. But now he said he does almost 1/4 of his business with the consumer market. So, selling selling consumer drives through Amazon.com, for example, where he has to worry about color and style. So the sort of the diversification, the volatility of demand, certainly for those kinds of markets has grown substantially, and as I said, is putting a lot of pressure on supply chain organizations. Next slide, please. But at the same time, if you sort of say, well, okay, I'm seeing increased volatility on the demand side, I'm seeing the cadence of the demand side picking up speed, we don't see that so much on the supply side, where we see actually a lot of complexity. I've talked in the first bullet about complexity versus complication, And to a degree, that's the notion of companies recognizing the inherent nature of complexity and attempting to not build too much complication around that complexity. But certainly as we think about supply networks becoming global, supply networks with longer and longer lead times, the graphic here is something that I call profitable proximity sourcing, which is certainly how we think that progressive manufacturers, progressive companies ought to be thinking about the supply side of their supply chain, which is to say, well, there's going to be some things which perhaps I want to cost optimize. There are going to be some things that I want to lead time optimize, and there are going to be still other things where I actually want to make it where I sell it. And there's all these kind of then external forces, things like supplier viability and risk management and protection of IP, for example. But at the end of the day, supply networks are getting complex. And because of the long lead times, we're seeing them become slower and slower. And the quote here I have is from a global consumer goods manufacturer, who basically says, I'm trying to manage multiple product categories with different and growing levels of complexity across a single supply chain that isn't optimized for any of them. And so it's it kind of gets back to that point from before about sort of supply chain segmentation and how important it is for companies to think a bit differently about the different kinds of supply chains that perhaps they want to have within the context of their single business. So this notion of supply complexity, I think, and global and extended supply lead times is a really significant one for a lot of these manufacturers. And in the next slide, I think you'll start to see where the two supply complexity and demand volatility start to bang heads. And this is sort of this cadence notion that Donna mentioned at the outset, which is that with demand volatility, manufacturers are expected to move faster and faster. With supply complexity, the inherent nature of that complexity means that that the supply side tends to be moving slower and slower. And so we have these cadence mismatches. We have these cycle time mismatches. And where where traditionally manufacturers have used, for example, buffer inventories as a way to mitigate speed mismatches across various elements of the supply chain, they're finding that as the demand and supply sides move increasingly out of whack, that in fact those buffer inventories just don't work all that well anymore, and they're having to start to think about different approaches. I talked about balancing forecasting and responsiveness in the notion of agility. That is certainly one. Using sort of risk management as a way to segment to the supply chain is another way. We certainly see companies looking at some of the new technologies, the technology pillars that I use down here, whether it's cloud capabilities, big data analytics, mobility, or social business. These kinds of technologies at least can be a way for companies to start to think about perhaps how to interact differently between the supply and demand sides of the supply chain. And I think for me, I call this sort of the supply chain challenge. I mean, there certainly are plenty of challenges, but I think for me, this notion of this fundamental misalignment of cadences is really a critical one for manufacturers as they think about how to manage their supply chains. So let me move to the next slide and introduce this notion of what I've called the resilient supply chain. And this, I think, is the way that I'd expect manufacturers to start to think increasingly. And I've put in the box at the top of the slide sort of the problem statement, right? The necessity for supply chain speed in the context of complexity and data overload, requires manufacturing supply chains to embrace resiliency and become sort of massively multidimensional. Massively multidimensional is a bit of a mouthful, but to me it sort of describes the evolving notions of things like supply chain segmentation. The fact that companies are increasingly looking to big data and analytics technologies to address real-time data-driven business problems. Right? They're looking at this as a way to start to bridge the cadence mismatches between the supply and demand sides. They're talking a lot about sort of collaborative demand sensing and planning, right? It's about understanding how far back I can go in the supply chain in terms of understanding supply, how far forward I can go in the supply chain in terms of understanding demand, collaborating with my trading partners, whether it's the retailer or a wholesaler, being much more collaborative in terms of the forecast, understanding demand as close as I can get it, so that I can be more reactive. I can give the supply side of my supply chain a little bit more time, if possible, to meet the needs of the market. And responsiveness balanced with forecasting. I've said responsiveness versus forecasting here. I think it's more balance of the two. Having that sort of fluidity in the supply chain, being adaptable, so that, as I said before, when things don't go as you want them to, or as you hope they will, that in fact you can respond in a transparent way. And I think this sort of, again, this notion of risk management, supply chain segmentation is I think leading to this notion of the massively multidimensional supply chain, where you have to be able to do lots of different things at the same time for lots of different products, and have that flexibility and agility to meet market needs. Next slide, please. So here I've just sort of presented a view of kind of planning in the supply chain. I perhaps more than most tend to think of everything as planning, right? So I mean, I've even sort of suggested here on the slide that planning sort of gets into fulfillment, whether it's the production planning parts or the factory scheduling parts, or even the planning of transportation. I think that as the SCORE model has articulated well for years, planning really does overarch the breadth of the supply chain. But there's a couple of new challenges, right? I mean, there's what I call here more data, less eyeballs, right? People have companies have less employees than ever before, less people looking at things, and at the same time you have more data. And so how do you reconcile those two things? And I think the answer is in better collaboration and in more sophisticated tools and capabilities, so that exceptions are less frequent and more things can be kind of no touch. I think it's also from a supply chain perspective, understand and leverage value, right? I mean, maybe some things you need in real time, maybe other things are fine to be aggregated. I think almost the worst thing you can do is invest in acquiring real time data and then not do anything with it in real time. So you've sort of wasted the investment in acquiring it. So I think it's important to understand sort of where you need real time data and where you don't. And then sort of align the strategic, tactical, and operational goals and activities, making sure that strategically you have the right approach, but that you're then meeting that approach, you're then conducting that approach with your tactics and your operational activities. And collaboration is a key capability. Next slide, please. I think you see here, so from a customer perspective. The collaboration certainly is sort of downstream with the customer, upstream with the supplier a little bit. Next slide, please. But as you kind of move out, I think manufacturers find that they want to collaborate both upstream and downstream, right? So it's not just demand collaboration; it's also supply collaboration, and we see that in some industry segments where, high-tech particularly, for example, where manufacturers actually do design collaboration with their suppliers. I come out of consumer packaged goods, and doing design collaboration is anathema. I would I would never do it. Yet, we're starting to see certainly some of the more mature manufacturing segments like high-tech actually do quite a lot of design collaboration with their suppliers. So it's collaboration is a really important part of the planning process, particularly if you feel pressure to be faster and quicker and more agile in the supply chain, really one of the most effective ways to do that is to get an earlier view both on demand and into supply. Next slide, please. So one of the things that we do at IDC is we do lots of surveys. We have lots of really interesting data. I did a survey earlier this year and asked manufacturers about their top supply chain priorities. And while cost is clearly number one, and frankly is almost always number one, I don't think I've ever conducted a supply chain survey where cost didn't come out in the top spot. But I think what's interesting is that the ability to respond more quickly to supplier demand changes. So again, this notion of supply chain agility was actually number two. It's viewed, at least from a priority perspective, more important than quality and safety and customer service. I'm not sure that I necessarily would agree that it's more important than those things, but the survey suggests that it certainly is, within surveying error, right there with those kinds of things in terms of its importance to manufacturers. Next slide, please. And it's not just about sort of the priority. It's also about okay, what are the things that these companies are going to do, right? So one of the things we also asked in the survey was, okay, if respond more quickly to supplier demand changes was your top priority, what are the things that you're going to do? What are the activity drivers? And they're the things that you see here on the slide, right? So improving the demand forecasts, improving manufacturing execution, factory flexibility and/or capabilities, enabling better supply chain traceability and visibility, reducing inbound lead times. They're all the kinds of things that companies are saying they need to do if they're going to be able to respond more quickly to supplier demand changes. And certainly where you see things like supply chain visibility and traceability, that is absolutely about collaboration. It's absolutely about collaborating better with suppliers, collaborating better with customers. And I think it's a critically important component of these companies' ability to be quicker, to respond more quickly to a supply interruption or an unexpected blip in demand. Next slide, please. And then just kind of, at least from a supply chain survey perspective, just kind of wrapping up. The other thing we asked was about top application investments, and we saw sort of closer responses this year than we've ever seen in the past, which perhaps suggests that manufacturers are having a harder time deciding between different kinds of investments than they have in the past. But regardless, we see the planning capabilities as really ascendant this year, and frankly in recent years, right? So we have sales and operations planning, production scheduling, inventory planning, demand planning and forecasting. They're all things that companies are saying are really important to my business, and I think really underscores, at least for me, in the context of these sort of this cadence mismatch, these cadence sort of discontinuity between the supply and demand sides, how important it is to collaborate around planning, how important it is to do a better job of planning, so that at least you can sort of get that piece in order. And then if ultimately you have to be able to respond beyond the plan, you have the bandwidth to do that. Next slide, please. The other thing that I would say is that at IDC Manufacturing Insights, we look at 4 different kinds of subsegments within manufacturing, and they're here on the slide, so I won't read them verbatim, other than to suggest that each of these 4 groups has sort of a slightly different challenge. And so the point of the slide is I think to bring home that no matter where manufacturers may sit, whether they're in the engineering-oriented value chains or in the brand-oriented value chains, some part of their supply chain is is dealing with volatility or dealing with complexity, right? So if you happen to be a technology-oriented value chain, if you're in high-tech electronics, for example, you probably have both supply complexity and demand complexity or demand volatility. So you've kind of got the worst of both. But no matter where you may be, there are still challenges. Perhaps the folks who have the easiest go of it are the asset-oriented value chains who tend to see low supply and low demand complexity. But even they have demand volatility challenges, certainly as they sort of aspire to maximize return on assets. But in all of the others, there's pressure, whether it's sort of, as I said, the engineering-oriented folks who have high supply complexity, or the brand-oriented folks, the sort of consumer packaged goods, the CPG companies who have high demand complexity. The importance of collaborative forecasting really can't be emphasized enough. It's critically important for them, particularly as they think about their business and how to meet their cost and service obligations. So let me close with the last slide, which is just sort of a few thoughts in conclusion. One, I think, is I certainly encourage the manufacturers that I work with, in thinking about their supply chains and thinking about forecasting and planning. Conduct a capabilities inventory, kind of understand where you are. To the degree that forecasting is tricky to benchmark, nonetheless, try to get a sense of kind of where you are against your competitive set. I think balance forecasting with responsiveness. If you realize, in fact, that your forecasting capabilities are competitive with your key competition, maybe responsiveness is the better place to invest. And then collaborate. I mean, collaboration is a term that gets terribly overused, I think, and has for a long time, but it's really important. I mean, those companies that do a better job of collaborating with customers, particularly around demand sensing, I think get a better forecast, and in turn, are able to turn that into certainly more consistent customer service levels. And then the last comment is we see a lot of companies with idle cash invest that idle cash. I mean, there's lots of opportunities in sort of the intelligent supply chain, right? There's lots of ways for companies really to drive some very interesting new capabilities that can make a big difference in the supply chain in the context of this sort of high complexity, high volatility environment. So let me turn it back to Donna. Donna, that's kind of how I see the marketplace these days from IDC's perspective.
Well, thank you, Simon, for a great presentation. And now I would like to turn it over to Dudley Lance, our sales director at Take Supply Chain Solutions. Dudley's going to be discussing some specific strategic and tactical benefits of forecast automation and also presenting a couple of customer case studies. Welcome, Dudley.
Well, thank you, Donna. First and foremost, I just want to kind of touch on the agenda. We're going to spend a few minutes talking about some of the business challenges associated with manufacturers and suppliers and being able to respond more quickly to demand as kind of a subset of some of the things that Simon had discussed earlier. So if you want to move on to the next slide, we'll go ahead and kick things off. So I think we're all familiar with the concept of the Bullwhip effect in supply chain. It's basically the source of the problem, which the term demand collaboration or that whole strategy was originated to address. And if you think about a bullwhip effect, it's really about, kind of paraphrasing, it's, how do you manage demand that you can't predict, with suppliers that you don't necessarily control. And if you look at it from that perspective, it really starts at the most, upstream part of your supply, or really the downstream part of your supply chain at the point of consumption or the consumer. And as you move upwards through the value chain, the information becomes more and more distorted. So as you move from the retailer up through distribution and manufacturing, this information it becomes more and more distorted, and it causes uncertainty really due to lack of real-time collaboration and visibility. And what this uncertainty necessitates is really kind of the buffer inventory that Simon had referred to earlier. A lot of companies, whether you be in manufacturing or distribution, are looking to mitigate that risk by buffering inventory. And so the subsequential impact in terms of inventory investment, cycle times, operational efficiencies, and margin erosion can be very substantial. So you go on to the next slide, please. So over the years, there have been several ways that organizations have attempted to address some of these supply chain challenges. I know Simon's a big fan of the planning aspects, and that's certainly a big part of the solution footprints that's been implemented over the years to address kind of demand volatility. You also have your execution systems in terms of MRP, ERP, warehouse management. Ironically, there's still a lot of companies using spreadsheets and B2B technology to kind of connect, the different constituents of the value chain. If we go on to the next slide, there's some inherent challenges with these types of tools, and one of the biggest challenges is you've really got multiple systems of record, so there's no single source of the truth to use when you're trying to engage in a collaborative process between you as a brand owner or manufacturer and your suppliers. In addition to that, you've got due to the various point solutions that aren't necessarily integrated together, you've got a fairly big problem around information latency, especially as you look further and further up the extended supply chain. So this results in what I call the stale data syndrome, which basically means by the time you get the data, it's meaningless in many cases. It's too late to actually act upon that data. A lot of companies have used B2B tools to connect their trading partner network to try to address this information latency. Some of the challenges associated with that tend to be just the overall costs. But a lot of the B2B platforms really lack the process management and workflow and business logic that are really needed to create value when you're talking about a collaborative process. And so finally, I would just add that none of these solutions by themselves provide what I would call a closed-loop collaboration capability, which you really need to kind of capitalize on your extended supply chain network. And this is really the kind of the key component to this notion of sense and respond capabilities that Simon had mentioned earlier. Next slide. So one of the things that has been prevalent with the whole notion of the Bullwhip theory. I shouldn't say prevalent, but one of the objectives of kind of solving this Bullwhip phenomenon is how do you decrease the Bullwhip effect? And so this example kind of shows the volume of orders and inventory over time from the point of consumption or the consumer upstream to the original source all the way to the manufacturer or the original supplier. And if you note this slide, you'll see the increase over time in the buffer stock, or the inability to meet your order demand in a timely fashion at each stage of the value chain, starting with from the consumer up to your retailer, distribution, and manufacturing nodes in your value chain. So really, this is what creates the lack of real-time collaboration and results in your information latency and ultimately starts to build up your costs in terms of inventory in your supply chain. So again, this is a before and after kind of comparison. So you'll note the contrast in the Bullwhip effect, by using traditional methods versus using an effective demand collaboration process. Next slide. So these are just some examples of really where you can measure the impact of improvements in demand collaboration. The financial impact is very significant typically, and it's measured in a number of ways. These are some examples where effective forecasted demand collaboration can impact your company. On-time deliveries, production efficiencies, not only for you but also for your suppliers in many cases, can be improved, along with your cash conversion cycle in terms of just being able to kind of increase the clock speed and the order cycle times. And then there's a direct impact in terms of cost containment on your material costs and days of inventory outstanding. So again, this is just kind of a snapshot of the areas that we typically see that are impacted by effective or in many cases ineffective demand collaboration. Next slide. So we've talked about some of the cases, some of the financial impact associated with collaboration. Now let's look at some tools that were specifically designed to improve the demand collaboration process. And once we go through that, we'll actually conclude with some actual customer examples. So Donna, if you go on the next slide. So what we have here is really a visualization of TAKE's onesCM supply chain collaboration platform. And again, this is intended really to automate extended business processes, multi-enterprise, kind of company to business processes throughout your value chain. And what this represents is really your trading partner ecosystem. What we offer from this platform is really a set of modular supply chain applications. And what we're going to focus on today is really around demand collaboration. This solution can be delivered via a software as a service or on an on-premise model. So there's a lot of flexibility there. Ultimately, what we strive to do with our solutions is provide a single source of the truth for all your participants throughout the value chain. So whether you're a brand owner, manufacturer, a supplier, a 3PL, or the end customer, it's a prerequisite to be able to, again, kind of sing from the same hymn book. And this type of platform enables you to connect your customer, your back-end ERP data with, upstream with your suppliers and really effectively collaborate from a business process perspective. Next slide. So if we drill into this just a little bit, looking more specifically at demand collaboration, this solution was purposely built to address the bullwhip effect in supply chain processes. And essentially what it does is enables the sharing of forecasts, commitments, and lead times in a closed-loop fashion, enabling kind of real-time exception-based alerts and notifications for your planners and buyers from the manufacturing side, and then also for the suppliers. So the business results with our customers have been very significant, and we'll share some of those examples with you in just a couple of slides. Next slide, please. So just a couple of screenshots here that will give you an idea of what a user interface would look like. Again, these are all web-based applications. A few key features that are required for effective demand collaboration processes include a common UI for both your planners and suppliers. This shows actual planning buckets that are user-defined, and you want to make sure you have a configurable and automated email notification process that can be deployed with immediate visibility into updates. So from a sense and respond perspective, you want to be able to determine if you have a mismatch in supply and demand, and then articulate that event upstream to your suppliers in a real-time fashion. And the same goes from a supplier commitment standpoint to the brand owners. When you have a request or a forecast that can't be met in a timely fashion, those commitments need to be communicated real-time and give you the ability to make the necessary corrective action to meet your demand. Next screen. And I think this is just another example of a screenshot where planners and suppliers can create notes and attachments based on the various planning buckets. So again, just a lot of flexibility and the ability to give your, you as a manufacturer and your strategic suppliers the ability to collaborate real time and make adjustments on the fly. To go to the next screen, I think one of the most important aspects of any collaboration process is to make sure the adoption rate is significant. And so if I'm a manufacturer and I'm looking to institute a new business process with some of my strategic suppliers, I need to make sure that the barrier of entry for that supplier to participate in that process is low. So it's one thing to have the technology, but the adoption is very, very important. I don't think we can underscore that enough. So typically what we see is from a supplier standpoint, if you look at some of your critical component suppliers, typically they have those types of goods drive a lot of value in your supply chain, so that's usually a good place to start. And as you go through this supplier adoption process, it's also important to articulate the benefits to your suppliers in terms of better production planning on their part, better asset utilization, even order fill rates. So, it's not just about, how can you optimize and better, meet your demand, but it's also about how can your suppliers benefit from it as well. So you want to make sure you make it easy for suppliers to participate and offer multiple collaboration options depending on their technology maturity. So in a lot of cases, it may be a portal that you're working with your suppliers on. In some cases, it could be a B2B connection for larger volume transactions as well. So again, I think flexibility in that perspective is very important. Next slide. I think we've got a couple of customer examples here we wanted to kind of end with. And one of our success stories is Baker Hughes. And I think Baker Hughes is fairly well known. They're an oil field services company with substantial, global presence and revenues. They actually started a procure-to-pay process way back in, back in 2007. And they implemented that procure-to-pay process with Take Solutions, and it did yield substantial savings and process improvements, but they were still challenged in a couple of cases with too much on-hand inventory, and that was created primarily from suppliers not adhering to things like shipping horizons. So there's really a kind of getting back to that cadence that Simon was referring to earlier. We knew what supply to, what supply to provide, but it wasn't being provided at the right time. So it was creating excess inventory in the terms of, tens of millions of dollars on an annual basis. And so what they did to address the problem was really to implement a demand collaboration process where they now share demand and forecasted material requirements for up to 18 months with selected suppliers. And this enabled both Baker Hughes as well as their suppliers to better plan both production and as well as synchronizing the commitments from the suppliers along with lead times and ship dates. And that led to ultimately to better visibility for the suppliers and the actual demand. And to date, the results have been very positive. I think the next case we have, if you go to the next slide, is Applied Materials. Now, Applied Materials, they were recognized back in 2011 by Progressive Manufacturing 100 and were awarded with High Achiever and Supplied Network Mastery status. So they got some kudos from some of the industry pundits around best practice for this kind of demand collaboration implementation that they were successful with. And this is an interesting case study. They're a little bit different business model. Their challenges were really highlighted by a very large bill of materials, which averaged at about 2,000 components. And 3/4 of those were actually sourced directly. So it was very important for them to improve the accuracy and visibility of their inbound deliveries, both in terms of quality and quantity. And the results from this initiative were significant as well. And you can read some of the bullet points in terms of the financial impact that was realized by Applied Materials. So with that, that concludes my part of the presentation. Donna, I'm going to hand it back over to you.
Thank you, Dudley. Before we get to the Q&A part of the presentation, I want to just provide a real quick review of Take Solutions. Take has been around since 1994, and we do have over 400 customers worldwide. Our supply chain center of excellence is headquartered in Austin, Texas, and we also have offices across the globe in Europe, Middle East, and Southeast Asia. We have, specifically within supply chain, we focus on suppliers collaboration and management, mobile data collection, RF and barcode printing applications, and returns management. If you've got any questions specifically about Take, I'm now putting up our information at on the next screen that you can either email me directly or Dudley directly, and we can get you that additional information. I do want to thank Simon and Dudley for a great presentation. As I mentioned before, they're going to be responding to questions for about the next 10 minutes. We're providing the phone number and the email addresses on screen for any questions that you may have after this presentation. We would like to hear from you, so please feel free to reach out to us. As a reminder, this broadcast will be available on demand via our websites at takesolutions.com and onesCM.com in a couple of days. So now I'll go ahead and get to the submitted questions. The first one, Simon, is for you. Can you talk a little more about demand sensing and what that really means? Is it more than traditional sales forecasting? And with that, can you talk a little bit about what tools are needed for demand sensing and what are some of the pitfalls to avoid?
Yep, sure. No, that's a very good question. Yeah, I mean, I think demand sensing is really the ability to get as close as you possibly can to the point of demand, right? I mean, I think the most obvious example of demand sensing is the use of point-of-sale data, for example. So in the consumer packaged goods industry, companies have really been exploring the use of what they call downstream data. So how can they get reliable, accurate, timely point-of-sale data from retailers in such a way that they can augment their forecasting process? So, is it more than traditional sales forecasting? I mean, to the degree that, traditional sales forecasting might have been, what did I do in a previous period? What are my promotions? Therefore, I crunch the numbers, and I come out with a forecast. I think it's, demand sensing is a little more granular. It's a little more, as I said, to the point of demand. So you get a much more insightful view as to how your products are being consumed, how they, when they need to be replenished. And I think certainly where companies have done and have used downstream data effectively, what they've seen is they've seen substantial improvements in the forecast. Now, it doesn't mean that the forecast is going to be perfect, but they certainly have seen improvements in the forecast to the point where the effort to collect it becomes well worth it. What tools are needed? I mean, I think it requires forecasting capabilities that can accept downstream data, that can accept granular sensing data as an input. I think that companies need the ability to get that data from their customers, and it doesn't just have to be consumer packaged goods; it can be other industries as well. But the data obviously needs to be available, and it needs to be available in a timely fashion. Collecting sort of various kinds of demand sensing data. I talked in my comments about some elements of data really lend themselves to real time. Others lend themselves to aggregation, and I certainly think if you're going to do demand sensing, it really needs to be in the main the kind of data that you get in real time, or certainly near real time on a near real time basis. Otherwise, the benefits of that slightly more enhanced, that closer to the consumer demand signal, really loses its relevance.
Oh, thank you. Dudley, this next question is for you. Can you outline what planning and procurement environments would benefit most from automated forecast collaboration like you described?
Sure, Donna. I think generally most organizations can benefit from any kind of improved forecast collaboration process. Typically what we see, in terms of, fastest time to value are those organizations with high demand variability, longer lead times, or highly valued source items. Those are typically the kind of the ideal targets, if you will, for the types of demand collaboration solutions that we deliver.
Okay, and then as a follow-on question, Dudley, how much is involved in an implementation? So what would be required to implement the solution that you previewed?
So there's really three basic areas to consider for implementation, starting with integration to your existing MRP or planning systems. And Take has out-of-the-box integration for some of the more widely used ERP solutions like SAP and Oracle. And we also have integration capabilities for ERP legacy, or we call it ERP agnostic type approaches. So that would be your first kind of task. The second part would be really the application and the workflow configuration, which is very important, and I underscore the word configuration. The way we've designed our solutions, again, purposely built for multi-enterprise collaboration, we give organizations the ability to configure workflow and business rules and do that in a way that really decreases the time to value, or shortens, I should say, the time to value. And then last but not least would be the supplier onboarding, which we spoke of earlier. And again, I think based on the size and complexity or maturity of that particular supplier, you'd want to provide the proper onboarding approach as needed. So whether it's a B2B connection or a supplier portal, that typical process from beginning to end, from a project perspective, usually will last anywhere from 3 to 6 months.
Okay, thank you. Simon, this next question is for you. How would someone go about measuring their clock speed alignment?
Well, I mean, that's an excellent question. I think the easiest way to start is to sort of compare a typical order lead time to overall supply lead times, right? So I've worked with a couple of manufacturers, and they may have an order lead time of 3 or 4 days, but then supply lead times of 60 days, let's say. So I think it's ultimately about starting with lead times, but I don't think it's as simple as that necessarily, because supply side lead times are always going to be, well, not always, but are generally much longer than demand lead times. So I think it's how you qualify that difference in terms of how much inventory do you keep. Are you doing some sort of kind of postponement or late stage delay, such that the inventory available can be used across across multiple orders? Is there kind of late stage configuration? So Don, I don't think there's one perfect answer, but I think a good starting place is to say, what are my average supply lead times versus what are my average demand lead times, and am I able to kind of ameliorate those with the various inventory and manufacturing processes and practices, such that my service levels are good. It's a complicated calculation, but I think that's probably as good a place to start as any.
Okay, good, thank you. Dudley, is the forecast collaboration limited to the collaboration platform, or do the ERP and data collection tracking platforms also need to be considered?
Well, that's an interesting question, Donna. I think the answer really lies in the fact that our systems, our solutions, can be integrated tightly to your ERP systems of record, whether it be Oracle or SAP, or other legacy ERP systems, and or data collection solutions. So regardless of the ERP or the system of record and the integration method that's involved, the end result is you want to try to improve your data velocity and decrease the information latency, and that's really our goal that we have to drive greater agility and better decision making within the organizations involved.
Thank you. It looks like we have time for one more question. Simon, I'll direct this one to you. Which of the 4 technology pillars you mentioned will have the biggest impact on helping to align clock speed, and how do the others rank and why?
Well, I think that one of the things I didn't talk about in my comments that came out of the supply chain survey that we did earlier this year was we actually asked manufacturers about those 4 technology pillars, and we asked them to kind of rank them in terms of importance. Now, that wasn't importance specific to clock speed or specific to planning collaboration, but certainly, big data and analytics was viewed by manufacturers as the top of the 4. And I think it's probably the right answer here in terms of clock speeds as well, because ultimately it's about understanding what's happening and then figuring out how to affect it. And I think what we're seeing is companies use more and more analytics, more and more embedded analytics, layered analytics, big data, medium-sized data, small data, all kinds of data, all kinds of analytics to try to do a better job of both modeling their supply chain and also responding and reacting to changes in the supply chain. So I think at the end of the day, big data and analytics is probably going to be the one that contributes most to companies' ability to kind of understand the disconnects between the supply and demand sides of their supply chain and how to at least manage to close the gap. I think that we see mobility probably second in terms of the ability to capture information from places in the supply chain that perhaps we weren't able to capture it from reliably in the past, as well as the ability to disseminate it to people who perhaps don't work in traditional office settings. And I think then cloud and social business probably come third and fourth. Cloud certainly gives companies the ability to more quickly consume IT capabilities, and that certainly has a place and has a role to play in terms of how they think about the cadence mismatches between the supply and demand sides. Social business, I mean, I think at the end of the day, it's certainly sort of intra-enterprise, right? The ability to sort of understand what employees might or might not be saying about the business, but also how customers are viewing their external, what their external view is of the business, right? And I think whilst that input is important, I think of the 4, that's probably the one that sits at number 4, at least in terms of this particular point around clock speed.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Simon and Dudley, for a great presentation. This does conclude the QA portion of our presentation. And thank you again for your participation. If we were unable to get to your question, or if you have follow-up questions, please email it to one of the addresses on the screen, and we will contact you directly with a response. We look forward to seeing you online or in person again very soon.